Negative cash flow rental properties. We call those alligators because they eat all of your money. And unfortunately, with today's high interest rates and high prices, more and more rental properties have negative cash flow. But I want to help you avoid that. And in this episode, I'm going to share 5 common mistakes that lead to negative cash flow and how you can avoid them. And everything that I'm going to share here comes from 22 years of rental property experience, including some negative cash flow properties of my own that I had to fix. Let's get started. The first mistake that can create negative cash flow on a rental property is simply forgetting to include expenses when you analyze a property up front. And I want to show you a brief example. And this is very typical when I run the numbers with other investors, what they show me up front. They'll say something like this: "Hey, Chad, I have $2,200 in rent on this property, and I've included the expenses like taxes are $400 per month, insurance is $125 per month, and the mortgage payment, the principal and interest, is $1,500 per month. So when I subtract those expenses, this property has positive cash flow of $175 per month or $2,100 per year." Well, actually, that's wrong, because what they forgot to do was include all of the other expenses that you actually have with a rental property. And I've learned this the hard way. When I first started investing in rental properties, I also forgot those expenses. So if you've done this, don't worry about it, but you can improve and make yourself better for the next time. So every rental property is different, but it typically includes things like a vacancy or a collections expense. This just means that you're not going to collect rent 100% of the time. Like, let's say the property is vacant 1 month every 2 or 3 years while it turns over. Well, that's money you're not collecting. So when you run the numbers up front, you need to account for that. You also have taxes and insurance like we talked about. That's correct. But you also have management expenses. And I know some of you are self-managing the property. And you say that's too expensive to pay a manager. But if you ever want to have this be a passive investment or a semi-passive investment where you can travel around the world, do things like I've done with my family, you got to include a management expense. Otherwise, you have an unpaid job that you have to do yourself, and you're kind of tied to it forever. So you want to include a management expense. Maintenance and capital expenses, these are two that are often under allocated, that people don't put enough money there. But capital expenses are the big type of maintenance things. Like if you have to replace the roof every 20, 30 years, you have to replace the driveway, plumbing, heating and air, hot water heaters, things like that. They're big expenses that don't happen as often. When they do, they're a lot of money. And then there are other expenses, like if you have a multifamily property, an older one, like I have several of, you might have to pay the common utilities for those tenants who live there. So in my case, I have to pay water for an entire 12-unit building. Or you might have to pay for electric, like if there's a common entrance area and you need to pay for the lights in that building. So you need to include those utilities as well. And then you might have some miscellaneous expenses. In my case, I have to pay rental licenses every year for the privilege of renting a property in my city. So they come out and inspect it, and I pay about $150 per rental property. So I need to include that as well. So let's include all of these expenses and see what the actual cash flow is in this example. We still have the same rent of $2,200 per month, but then we have vacancy expense of about $100 per month. We have $400 in taxes, $125 in insurance, $210 in management expenses. And I just assumed that it was about a 10% management fee of what you collect. So the rent after taking out the vacancy expense. We have $150 in maintenance, $150 in capital expenses that we might not spend this year, but we might spend it over time, in one big chunk every 5 years or 6 years. And then in this case, we're going to assume we don't have utilities. Let's say this is like a duplex where the tenants pay for all their own utilities. And then we have a $25 per month rental license fee. So when you total up all of those operating expenses, it's about $1,040 per month. And then you also have to subtract your $1,500 per month mortgage payment. And so when you subtract all of that from the rent, we actually have a negative $460 per month negative cash flow, or negative $5,520 per year. Now compare that to what we thought it was of positive $2,100 per year. That's a negative swing of over $7,000 per year just by forgetting your expenses. The second mistake that can create negative cash flow rental properties is buying older, cheaper properties because you think the cheaper properties make better cash flow. And let me tell you an example that taught me this lesson. This is an old mill house, and in the South, we had textile mills in the 1920s and 30s. So these old neighborhoods with these 1920s and 30s houses, you can buy pretty cheap in many cases, especially the ones that are still kind of run down. And in 2007, I bought a property for $30,000. So 2 bedroom, 1 bath, 1,000 square foot property, had wood siding, and It needed work, as I found out later on, but it was rentable, meaning you can move into the property. It was clean and neat, things like that. And we got it for $1,000 down. And the seller who sold it to us financed the balance of it at $180 per month. So on the surface, this property rents for $400 to $450 per month at that time. And we could buy it for $1,000 down with $180 per month payment. You would think that would do pretty well. If you've ever studied the 1% rule, it met the 1% rule. Everything looks good, right? Well, let me fast forward and tell you the end of the story. 7 years later, in 2014, we sold this property for a loss for $22,000 to another investor. And in the meantime, between the time we bought the property and when we just rented it out and had several tenants who didn't work out, we lost $13,500 in negative cash flow. Now, how did that happen? It looked like we had positive cash flow, right? Well, it happened because we had to do repairs on the property, capital expenses. We had to cut some trees down that were about to fall on the property. It had wood siding, and we had to have that property scraped, and had old lead-based paint, so you had to spend more money fixing that. We had moisture issues in the crawl space that we had to fix, including some rotten wood that we had to fix. We had a hot water heater go out. We had to fix the driveway, the gravel washed out. We had some electrical issues that we had to fix. And even with all that being fixed, there were still issues that we didn't fix that when we sold the property, the next person was going to have to do, like replacing all of the wiring in the house, all of the plumbing, things like that. Long story short, the older a property is, the more huge capital expenses and gotchas and the mysterious things that are going to come up that can cause negative cash flow. And think about this for a minute. Even if I had a positive $100 or $200 per month in cash flow on this kind of property, on this low rent property, one $5,000 expense wipes that out for well over a year. And so the actual cash flow on these cheaper properties doesn't usually work out. And the reason they're cheap is because they need all this work. Now, there's a case for taking a property like this and just gutting it and taking it down to the studs and replacing everything. But the price would be different. If I bought it for $30,000, I might spend $40,000 or $50,000 to get it fixed up to that level. And in some cases, that can make sense. But the lesson here, the mistake I made, and maybe you have made on a property, is thinking that these older properties are going to cash flow just because you bought it cheap. Not always the case. The third mistake that investors make that can lead to negative cash flow is the financing. Now, if there are one lesson, one takeaway that I hope you get from this video is that your financing and your cash flow are directly related. And let me prove it to you with a real simple example. Let's say you could buy a $300,000 property, and instead of going to the bank to get financing, you had $300,000 cash sitting in the bank that you could use to buy the property. Now, if you paid cash for the property with zero mortgage payment, likely you would have a positive cash flow, right? Now, you might not want to do that. Maybe you want to spread it out over more properties, use some leverage. I understand the benefits of that. But the point is, the amount of your financing, the interest rate of your financing, the payment on your financing affects your cash flow in a big way. So a couple ideas, we could talk about this for hours, and I do on my channel a lot, but two big ideas that I want you to think about. Number one is considering a 30-year mortgage instead of a 15-year mortgage. Now, some people want to go with a 15-year mortgage because they want to get a little bit lower interest rate maybe, and they want to pay their loan down faster. Now, I get that appeal. As a small and mighty investor, I like eventually paying some debt off on my properties, but I almost always go with a 30-year mortgage with the longest amortization I can get because it has a lower payment. That reduces your risk. It makes you more flexible. And just look at the numbers. If you borrow $250,000 at 6.5% interest, a 15-year mortgage will have a $2,178 payment, and a 30-year mortgage will have a $1,580 payment. That's a difference of right at $600 per month. So that can make a huge swing in your cash flow. So what I would rather do is get a 30-year mortgage. And if I had 10 properties, all with 30-year mortgages instead of 15, I would save $600 times 10 on all those properties. That's $6,000 per month. That can make a huge, huge difference. And if I wanted to start paying my loans down, I could still do that. You can always pay it off early on a 30-year mortgage, but you can't go the other way around. You can't go backwards with 10, 15-year mortgages. So number one, think about going with longer amortizations instead of 15-year amortizations. And the second idea is start learning how to use something called creative financing. Now, this isn't something you can do maybe as a 101 beginner investor, but start trying to learn how to talk to sellers about financing the property. I bought a lot of properties with seller financing. Many of them were former landlords who were kind of burnt out from being a rental property investor, or they're just ready to retire. And instead of just collecting rent, they agreed to finance the property to me, where I make a down payment to them, and they essentially become my bank. So for example, let's say I bought a property for 300,000, put 50,000 down, and then the seller financing was 250,000 bucks. So I'll be making payments to the seller. And if I can negotiate a lower interest rate, which is the big benefit that I might be able to get, is it's all negotiable. The bank gives you a interest rate and says, here's what the interest rate is based on the market, 6.5%, 7%, whatever. Well, with the seller, they might be motivated to sell the property. And if they got their price, maybe they're willing to take a lower interest rate. I've found that to be the case in many situations. So let's say that was the case. At a $250,000 financing with a bank or the traditional mortgage at 6.5%, that payment would be $1,580. But at 4.5%, that would be $1,267. So you could save about $313 per month by negotiating the interest rate down. Now, the same thing works if you could also work with private lenders. This is a whole nother area of real estate investing, but maybe you could find somebody who has what I call lazy money, where they used to be an investor, but they have extra money on the side and they just want to put it with somebody else and let them do all the work, and they kind of passively collect some interest. I've done that personally as both the lender and the borrower. There's a lot of people out there if you start looking for them and talking to them in real estate investing circles. And one of the benefits is they are also flexible on the terms of their interest rates and their payments. Now, they might want a little higher interest rate than a seller would who's motivated to sell their property. But even let's say if you could do the same interest rate as you could get at the bank, let's say 6.5% in this case. What if you could negotiate an interest-only payment with your private lender just for like a 10-year period so you could afford to have the rents go up and you could kind of get over that initial period of negative cash flow in your property? Well, if you could get an interest-only payment with the private lender at the same interest rate, that might be a $1,354 payment instead of the bank's payment of $1,580. That's a $226 difference in more positive cash flow working with a private lender. The fourth mistake that many of us make as investors that leads to negative cash flow is related to the financing, but it's all about the down payment. Now, we as investors got a little bit spoiled a few years ago because the norm was that you could put 20% down, get a very low interest rate, and still make your property either positive cash flow or maybe even break even cash flow. That's not the norm anymore, and it historically was not the norm either. And let me show you the numbers on why that's the case. So let's go back to our rental property that has a $2,200 per month payment. And remember, we talked about operating expenses like taxes, insurance, maintenance, management, vacancy, things like that. In our example, that was $1,040 per month you have in expenses. That's everything except for your mortgage payment. Now, this is a really important calculation in rental property investing. One I do on every single rental property is to figure out what's called the NOI, the net operating income. And so you just take your rent, you subtract all your operating expenses, and in this case, that's $1,160 per month. Now, what that number does is it tells you this is how much I can afford to use to pay my mortgage and also to pay me a positive cash flow, hopefully, on this rental property. So really, another way of thinking about that is the most you can pay on your mortgage payment and still break even. And back when interest rates were 4%, you could put $60,000 down, borrow $240,000, and at 4%, you could probably have a payment that was like $1,150 per month, and therefore you could make the numbers work. Well, today, with the same down payment, 20%, your payment's almost $1,600 per month, and you have a big negative cash flow. Well, that's probably not news to you, right? But the option that I want to talk to you about is you could choose, if you have the money, to put more money down to lower your payment. So instead of $60,000 down, you could put $125,000 and a little bit in a change. You could put that down payment. Maybe that's 42% down instead of 20% down. And you would have a payment that's about $1,160 per month. So you might have a response to me. You might say, hey, Chad, I don't have $125,700. All I have is $60,000. So I'm not going to be able to buy the rental property if I have to do that. Well, there's a couple options still. One option is you could partner with somebody, and I have videos on my channel about how do you go out and find people who have extra money sitting around. They're like somebody who's kind of lazy money again, and they can't find rental properties, or they don't want to manage rental properties, but they're willing to partner with you, the person who finds a good deal and is willing to manage it. So one idea is finding a partner to put up some or all of the down payment, and then they kind of participate passively with you. That's one idea. Another idea is that you could try to get the property at a lower price. So instead of buying the property at $300,000, what if you could find a good deal? What if you could find something that's a fixer-upper or a motivated seller? And you have to look pretty hard. This isn't just going to land on your lap. But what if you could buy a property at $240,000 instead of $300,000? That's a 20% discount. So because you bought it at a lower price, you could actually put less money down. You'd only have to put $65,000 down in order to get that same mortgage amount of $174,300. So the answer to this is, number one, you could put more money down. You could find partners to help you do that if this is a good deal, or you could just get better at buying properties at a discount, which historically is what investors have had to do to make properties have positive cash flow. The fifth mistake that we investors make that leads to negative cash flow is tenant screening. Now, I learned this the hard way as a rental investor, that if you get good at this skill, you will make much more positive cash flow in your rental properties. Or if you're not good at this skill of tenant screening, you will make a lot of negative cash flow, and it might even knock you out of the business completely. Now, I want to explain this with numbers again, that why tenant screening is so important. Remember, we had this rental property where we went through all the operating expenses. So we had a rent of $2,200, and we had all these line item of expenses like vacancy, taxes, interest, management, maintenance, etc. Well, the top line item there was vacancy. So if you had $100 a month in vacancy, that was my assumption when we did our numbers earlier. That's assuming that your property is only vacant a half a month of every year, approximately. So like once every 2 years, you might have a 1 month vacancy when somebody moves out and you have another person moves in. That's what that assumption is. But let's go to a different situation. Let's say you didn't screen your tenants very well and you had somebody stop paying you. And let's say it took you 6 months to get the proper person out of the property, either talking them out into moving and then moving on their own, or having to file an eviction. It can be very costly, and it could take a long time, depending on what state you're in, to get them out of the property and also to get it re-rented and get it fixed up again. So I'm just going to show you what would happen if it took 6 months to have that person on average move out because you didn't screen tenants very well. Instead of a $100 vacancy, you would actually have a $1,100 vacancy every single month on average because of that long vacancy period. So even if everything else were the same, all the other expenses, your mortgage payment was the same, you would have a negative $980 per month cash flow instead of a break even or a positive cash flow in another situation. And that equals almost $12,000 negative cash flow per year. That is a huge, huge swing. But that's not the whole story, because every time somebody moves out, you also have eviction fees if you're having to evict them, paying an attorney to help you do that, paying the court to do that. And you also have turnover and repair fees. One of the big lessons I learned as a rental investor is that every time a tenant moves out, you have cost, even if they're a great tenant, because there's some wear and tear on the property. You got to clean the carpet, you got to paint the walls, you got to do things just to spruce it up and make it a nice place to live for the next person. I found that to be minimum $500, but more likely like $1,000 just to kind of turn it over. And it might be a lot more if somebody tore the property up. So there's going to be more fees. So you could have well over $10,000 in annual costs from not being a good landlord at tenant screening. But I actually have a list of criteria I use to screen for tenants. And if you want to get a copy of that, I'd be happy to share a free download with you. You can go to coachcarson.com/tenant screening. I also have a link here in the YouTube video and also in the podcast in the YouTube description below. But in short, having written tenant screening criteria that you stick to, or that you ask your property manager to stick to make sure that they are able to pay, that they have a history of paying other landlords on time, that they have a credit score that allows them to pay, that they have the income to pay, even if they have a good credit score. Do they have enough income left over to pay this amount of rent? Can they afford it? There's a lot of things that go into evaluating it, almost like you're making a loan to someone. That's very similar to what the tenant screening process is like. And getting good at it, like I said, can make a great experience for your rental business. I have some of my favorite people are the tenants who live in our properties. They're amazing. But on the other hand, if you don't screen well, it can be a really negative experience and lead you to not wanting to be a rental investor because of all the negative cash flow. Now, this whole video might seem a little negative because we had 5 mistakes that lead to negative cash flow. Remember what they were? Number 1, forgetting your expenses. Number 2, buying older, cheaper properties. Number 3, the financing. Number 4, down payments. And number 5, tenant screening. So to put all of this together and to put a more positive spin on having cash flow that's positive with your rental properties, I want to recommend my next video, which is all about how to buy rental properties that still have a positive cash flow, even in a market with 7 and 8% interest rates. So if you want to learn how to do that, click on the thumbnail above me here if you're watching on YouTube, or click on the link in the podcast or YouTube description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.